everyone. Good evening. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Joe Lopez. I have the pleasure of welcoming our special guest tonight, and I am the Vice President of Marketing and Communications for the Richard Nixon Foundation. Wanted to thank you for being here tonight. It's my honor to welcome to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum a distinguished public servant and leader, the 46th Governor of Arkansas, Asa Hutchinson. Under his leadership as governor, he secured over $700 million per year in tax cuts for the citizens of Arkansas, safeguarded the retirement pay of veterans from state income tax, shrunk the size of the state government, created over 100,000 new jobs, and led a national initiative to increase computer science education. Very important. The governor's distinguished career as a public servant began when President Reagan appointed him as the youngest U.S. attorney in the nation for the Western District of Arkansas. In 1996, he won the first of 3 consecutive terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. And during his 3rd term in Congress, President George W. Bush appointed him to serve as administrator of the DEA and later as the nation's first Undersecretary of Homeland Security for Border Protection. Recently, the governor also had the distinction of serving as chair of the National Governors Association, a group that consists of all 50 governors from around the country, as well as leaders from our territories and commonwealths. Governor Hutchinson has a true experience and a wealth of knowledge, and has established him as a national resource, especially in the areas of trade, energy, and national security, topics that he's going to touch on here tonight. He has a deep understanding of the challenges facing our country and our world today, and I know you'll find his insights and perspectives on a wide range of topics to be thought-provoking, inspiring, and informative. So with that, please welcome Governor Asa Hutchinson.
Well, thank you, and what a delight to be here at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library, and I want to thank the foundation and the library for this invitation and for each of you to come out tonight. And it's a great trip that I'm taking here to Orange County. I've been here for a couple of days. I spoke to the Orange County GOP. I spoke to a couple different clubs, but the highlight, of course, is being here at the Nixon Library this evening. And I got here early enough so that I could do a tour, and it was a brief tour, and I wanted to do more. And let me tell you, I want to come back. And of course, for those who lived through some of that arena, it is very nostalgic. It remembers the difficulty of that time and when President Nixon was president and the challenges that our nation faced. And I was just a young high school student at the time, but as I saw what happened on the college campuses, what happened in the Vietnam War, it certainly impacted me as a young 18-year-old. And so I'm grateful for President Nixon's leadership and the way he was able to end the war in Vietnam and exercise that leadership. And I think about how that was handled and how that impacted even my life and the life of this in Arkansas. As many communities across America, we had the privilege of welcoming Vietnamese refugees into Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, by the thousands and by the thousands. And today, Fort Smith, where I spent 19 years living, that we have an incredible Vietnamese community. And they came through that airlift, and they have added to the culture of our state and our community. They're entrepreneurial, they work hard, they love freedom, and they love America. And so I'm grateful for the way the president led the conclusion of that and had that welcoming spirit for those that fought for freedom in their country and was suffering from oppression. And so a lot of memories as I did the tour today, but I wanted to speak tonight about the topic that was presented, which is China, the Cold War, And of course, we want to look at the challenges that we face with the cartel. And you think, how in the world are those connected? But hang with me for just a little bit. And before I, though, get into my formal remarks, I did want to talk a little bit more about my time as governor and my experience and where I think that our country needs to go. And first of all, I finished 8 years as governor of Arkansas, one of the highest privileges in my public career. And I've served 2 presidents. It's been an honor to have those opportunities of service, but to be there as governor where you can make an impact every day and lead a state through challenging times, such as a pandemic, it was an honor and a privilege to serve. And we did a lot during that time. Part of it was mentioned in my introduction, but whenever I went in, I wanted to lower taxes. We did that. We went from 7% down to 4.9% income tax rate. That's about $700 million a year from state revenue that goes back to the taxpayers. And yes, in the 1930s, we lost a lot of Arkies and Okies to here to California. We've got just a few of them coming back these days, and we welcome them, and it really reflects the connections that we have. But I was also able to not just cut taxes, but to invest in education and more teacher pay and computer science education that is so critical to our country today. And then to recruit businesses to our state, grow our state by 100,000 jobs over the 8 years of my service. And then for the first time in history, when I finished my time as governor, we passed the torch from one Republican administration to a second Republican administration, and that's Sarah Huckabee Sanders. And so we had a consistent conservative record, accomplished a great deal during that time that I'm very proud of. But as I have served our government in different capacities and the people of America, I'm obviously concerned about the direction of our country and where we go in 2024. So sign me up as one of the people that are of many that are considering 2024 and running for president. Now, and so I'm in the messaging time right now, and next month in April, I will make a decision and I will announce that decision. So I just ask you to stay tuned. But that journey that I've been on has taken me to South Carolina, to Iowa, coming here to California. And of course, there's nothing like going into Iowa, one of the early caucus states. I was flying in the airplane going into Des Moines, and there was a businesswoman sitting beside me. And she looked at me and said, "You're coming in here for 2024, aren't you?" And I just looked at her and I said, "Well, how did you know?" And she says, "We just know things in Iowa." And so it's been a wonderful experience just thus far, but I care, as you do, about our country, about our position in the world, in global affairs, and also domestically, how we are trying to survive through a time of excessive federal spending that leads to inflation, that leads to high interest rates, that leads to bank closures. And we've got to get back to having a controlled federal spending that we can actually balance the budget. In Arkansas, we balanced the budget. I did it 8 times. And the last time that we had a federal budget that balanced was over 20 years ago when I was in the United States Congress. Now, I won't take all the credit for that, but it did happen on my watch. And I was a part of that, and it shows the importance of having those kind of controls in our federal spending, that we don't get into hurting our families through high inflation, high interest rates that impact our loans and our credit card bills. And so that's just a little bit about where I am and where we're going. But I wanted to make a few more formal remarks, if you will, about the topic that I presented, which primarily focuses on China. And in my private sector capacity and as governor, I have traveled across the globe, recruiting businesses for Arkansas, but also in my private sector, just being able to travel, represent businesses. And there was one occasion, and that's actually brought me to China about 5 times. So I've been there, I've seen it in the modern world. But one time really stressed to me exactly what China was about and the controls that they have in place. I was there negotiating a business transaction with a Chinese business group. And as in the middle of that meeting, they said, we need to take a break because we need to call Beijing. And whenever they're saying call Beijing, they're talking about calling their assigned person from the Central Committee. And then as governor, I go there and I meet with businesses trying to say, you know, you're producing here, can we produce in the United States, growing our manufacturing sector in the United States. But I will be in a meeting and the business leaders will be there, but the most important person in that room was the secretary of the local Communist Party. Everyone was deferential to them. They clearly controlled it and directed things and managed the affairs. And while we do business in China, and recognize that the people of China are more entrepreneurial in spirit than we ever give them credit for, and they believe in family, but at the same time, they have an autocratic leader that is following the communist central control that impacts the future of that country and the relations with the United States and the freedoms that people actually want. And so that's a little bit of background. But the topic of my conversation this evening is very timely and even more critical because this week, as you know, President Xi Jinping met with Mr. Putin in Russia, and the world was watching what happened this week and saying, what is going to be the outcome of that? Are they going to grow closer together? Or is China going to move to supply more arms to Ukraine? We watched and we waited, and so the topic of China and Russia is particularly important this evening. But the big question was, as the world watched, as to how China and Russia will build on their no limits friendship. But let's review history first before I delve into exactly what the United States needs to do today. Our relationship with China is interwoven with the legacy of President Nixon. It was President Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, who negotiated China's rapprochement with the United States. This led to the UN recognizing the People's Republic of China and giving it a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. The relationship with China continued to improve under subsequent administrations. Under President Carter and Reagan, we enhanced our trade relationships. We continued to engage with them. But in the Bush 41 administration, the Tiananmen Square massacre occurred. And the United States suspended military sales and froze relations with China for some time. Later, President Clinton from Arkansas, as president, engaged in a policy of constructive engagement with China, which led to the release of some of the Tiananmen Square protesters. And then, as a result of that, Congress, at President Clinton's urging and lobbying and forceful efforts, requested the permanent normal trade status with China. I was in Congress at the time. It was the first time that my brother, who was in the United States Senate, and myself disagreed on a vote. And that was a story in and of itself. And the debate was on trading status with China. President Clinton was pushing for normal trading status with China. And there was a debate, and my district was divided on it. I ultimately decided with the members of Congress to support trading relations with China. And I did this for 2 reasons, and I think the president did it for 2 reasons, and the Congress as a whole thought that giving more economic freedom to China would enhance other forms of freedom in that society. Because when you have a thirst for freedom, our thought is that it expands. And so surely religious freedom and more press freedom and other types of freedoms will follow the economic freedom that they will gain with the trading relationships they have with the United States. The second compelling reason was we wanted to bring China into the world order. We wanted them to follow the trading rules of the WTO, and that we can then enforce the protection of intellectual property. We can make sure they follow the fair rules of trade that is important in global affairs. So those were the two reasons that we gave trading status to China. And guess what? Over the course of history, neither one of those two criteria have been met. The economic freedom that we hoped that would expand to greater freedoms has not, because of the repressive leadership of President Xi. And then secondly, China has continued to disregard their obligations under normal trading rules that all the trading nations follow. And so they have continued to steal our intellectual property. They've continued to violate the rules of trade. And so that has been an outcome today that has been a disappointment to many. But the result of all of this is that the U.S. trade deficit with China has expanded dramatically, and the economies of the United States and China have become interwoven and interconnected. But in the last 3 years, it has changed again. And in the last 3 years, we had President Trump that engaged in a trade war with China that disrupted the progress of economic vitality between the countries and interchange. And then secondly, we had a pandemic. And that pandemic strained the relations, isolated China more because of their protection of the spread of the virus in their community and their lockdown. And so obviously those two factors have once again put the relationships at a very chilled temperature as we look at the future. And so that is a little update in terms of history, but I want to give you more. And so if you look more deeply into the historical context of our relations with China and what President Nixon faced whenever he went there during his administration. And so 50 years ago, while President Nixon was in office, China was needing a U.S. alliance to keep the Soviet Union in check. The number of Soviet divisions on the Chinese border during that time had grown from 21 in 1969 to 33 in 1971 to 45 in 1973. And so their great security concern was the Soviet Union and that 4,000-mile border. Dr. Kissinger, in his book, Years of Upheaval, described the Sino-Russia relationship as follows. Quote, the conflict between the Soviet Union and China transcended ideology. It was primeval. The two tremendous continental countries shared a frontier of 4,000 miles in a vast area, and then he goes on to explain the adversarial relationship between the two countries. And so, for that reason, and their concern about the Soviet Union, they looked to the United States as someone that could be a higher level security partner for them. And so that set the stage for the reapproachment during President Nixon's time. And the result today, as a result of all of this, China has the second leading economy in the world, has the largest military in size, and the second largest budget for military. And China now pretends to be a world peacemaker, while at the same time the communist regime suppresses human rights at home, imprisons political prisoners, and brutally crushes freedom of speech and religion. And yes, they imprison religious and ethnic minorities from Christians to Muslims. That is the China that we face today under President Xi's leadership. There's been another change with China's leadership in recent years. 50 years ago, China was content with letting Taiwan alone. Today, under President Xi, China is very clear that it intends to take over Taiwan. And if you believe that words mean something, the United States should pay attention. This brief history that I've outlined, combined with the current tensions, lead to the question as how does the United States respond to this new world of China, Russia, and their desire for global leadership. As we know, the Shanghai Communique that was signed in February of 1972 at the end of the Nixon's visit to China is still the operative policy of the United States. It created the One China policy, but left the details to the future and is the foundation of our current policy of ambiguity. What drove China to agree to this communique was simple. Its fear of the expansionist and aggressive goals of the Soviet Union and its version of communism. Today, the dynamics have changed, and China is more aggressive toward the United States and certainly Taiwan. Our policy of ambiguity should be refined. It should be clear that any aggression of China toward Taiwan will not stand, and the United States will support Taiwan's defense. Here are the points that I want to make tonight, additional points. First of all, as you can see from history, that China is not a natural ally of Russia. As John Kirby said, it is a marriage of convenience. Putin is getting a much-needed friend on the world stage, and Xi Jinping gets to play global leader. We should remember that marriages of convenience can end quickly when the relationship becomes inconvenient. The parties can break up. The United States needs to increase the pressure on China and make them feel the pain of Russia's friendship. Secondly, China is a threat to us economically, and we cannot let them win in the power of the economies. And how do we compete in the world of technologies, in the world of artificial intelligence? We compete because we have to be able to train our students in being able to navigate through computer science and all the different aspects of that. And that is the reason in Arkansas, when I became governor, I said we want to put a priority on computer science education, and we were the first state to require computer science to be offered in every high school. At that time, we had 1,100 students taking computer science, and we only had 20 teachers that were certified to teach it across the entire state. That 1,100 students, because of my leadership and my pushing it and the legislature supporting it, the 1,100 students grew to 23,000 students last year. And because of that, we were able to go from 20 certified teachers to over 650 certified teachers in computer science. And today, we actually require computer science to be taken by high school students as a requirement for graduation from high school. As chairman of the National Governors Association, I took that initiative nationwide, and I got 50 governors of states and territories to sign a compact saying we are all going to lead in the area of expanding computer science education in our states. Why is that important? Because as the United States looks at innovation, as we look at technology investments in our country, where are we going to get the talent? We're either going to get the talent from overseas, or we're going to lose our industry, our tech industry overseas, or the third alternative is the right alternative, and that is to produce the talent here in the United States of America. It is truly a national security issue, and it is foundational for us to be able to compete economically on on the world stage and with China specifically. The third thing the United States needs to do is to assert its global leadership again. The United States should make it clear that Europe and our other allies are necessary partners in any peace solution between Russia and Ukraine. China is trying to broker for peace, and that will lead to Russia winning. China shaping the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran is not helpful, or advocating for a peace plan that rewards Putin is not helpful, and particularly when Putin is engaged in violation of sovereignty and crimes against humanity. It's not healthy for geopolitical stability and freedom, and the United States needs to lead on the global stage in terms of freedom and democracy and trying to find solutions for stability across the globe. We cannot abandon that responsibility. Fourthly, we need to change from a China-centric supply chain for the key industries such as healthcare, technology, products, and critical minerals that go into our military products and armaments that we need here in the United States of America. If you think back just during the pandemic, it's unbelievable that as a governor, we're scrambling around for N95 masks, and they're nowhere to be found. And we are competing with each other trying to get N95 masks, and of course we discover there's not sufficient, if any, manufacturing of those personal protective equipment here in the United States. And so it's manufactured in China. So as governor, I'm calling China, and I'm trying to get time on a factory floor for the production of PPE for the state of Arkansas. And we actually buy production time on a manufacturing floor, and then they call us and say, well, you were outbid by New York. They put more money in for that time of manufacturing. And so clearly what we went through in the last pandemic should not be repeated. We need to make sure that we move manufacturing back to the United States for critical medical equipment, for our pharmaceuticals, for our precursors that are necessary for those pharmaceuticals, and for our military equipment. That is critically important for us. Obviously, we're still going to trade, we're going to still have the industrial connections, but those critical industries need to move back to more friendly territory. And that is a lesson that we learn. The fifth point that I would make in terms of what the United States needs to do is we do not want a new Cold War. A new Cold War is not what we want, but may be upon us, and it might be unavoidable. Regardless, America must firmly assert its leadership and strengthen our military capability. But first, we must use our economic might and leverage to push China away from Russia. We need to be realistic that the world has yet another autocratic leader who wants to build a powerful coalition of like-minded oppressors at the expense of the Western world. And we must be clear that while a one China policy is still in place, we will do everything in our power to support our friends in Taiwan and help them push back firmly against any Chinese aggression. This is not about what is good for friends and neighbors, but it is about what is best for the security of the United States of America. And so I think there's a principle involved here, and that is that weakness invites aggression. Of course, we saw the botched pullout of our forces from Afghanistan, and the world watched that as we were in disarray, abandoning those that had stood with us and abandoning military equipment and abandoning the mission in Afghanistan. And that weakness that was demonstrated led to Russia saying, this is a good time to go into Ukraine. It led to China being more aggressive toward Taiwan. And so weakness invites aggression. And the only choice of the United States of America is to be strong, to be number one in terms of military strength, and to lead by strength. It is about sovereignty versus aggression. It's about stability in Europe. It is about assuring peace by supporting the oppressed versus the oppressor. And so that's the principle abroad, but you look at home, and I'll bring it back down for a moment to the cartels. At home, there's another principle at stake, and that is that we as a nation that supports the rule of law must secure our southern border. Just in the last fiscal year that we're not completed with yet, there were 1,664 Chinese nationals that came through the southern border. 90% of those were single males. If we're going to have asylum seekers that come to the United States of America, come into our ports of entry and claim asylum and let us process it effectively. We're a land of immigrants, and we welcome our immigrants, and we don't want to change the importance that they bring to the fabric of our democracy and our society. But we are a nation of laws and rules, and we need to have a secure border. It is important to us. And weakness empowered other nations when we showed it, but the weakness also empowered the cartels. The cartels that cause such human misery along our southern border in bringing in migrants in dangerous circumstances, oppressing and committing sexual offenses against those and kidnappings. They are truly foreign terrorist organizations. And the United States of America, this administration needs to declare the cartels in Mexico that are creating this human misery as a foreign terrorist organization. That will allow us to use more tools to go after them and to suppress that violence that kills American citizens. And if you just look at the fentanyl that comes into the United States, that's devastating our communities, that caused over 100,000 overdose deaths last year, we have to say that the fentanyl is a crisis in America. And the fentanyl starts with the precursors, chemicals that come from China into Mexico to the cartels, and the cartels make it and they bring it across the border into our communities. The United States of America cannot secure the border unless we go after the cartels and diminish their strength. And to do that, we actually need the cooperation of Mexico. And so we have to declare them a foreign terrorist organizations. We have to make sure that Mexico feels the heat, and they need to say, we're going to be a nation of law as well, and we're not going to let the cartels run over our society and endanger our citizens. We need a partner in this. And so while I was head of the DEA, we had that partnership. We were going after successfully some of the cartel organizations and dismantled them. But others rise up, and President Obrador in Mexico is not having the same strength to say we're going to accommodate the cartel versus to enforce the law against the cartel. So that is critically important for us as well. I hope this evening I've given you some food for thought. This is an important issue for our country. We have to get it right. These relationships are critical, as President Nixon understood. And I want to end with this, and that is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who is the famed Russian dissident who spent time in the prisons in Russia. And what he said was, if America does not lead the free world will not have a leader. And I believe those words are still true today, that America must lead. We must lead in freedom. We must lead in the rule of law. We must lead in support of the dignity of humanity. That's what America and the goodness of America is about. Thank you, and God bless you.
All right. We're going to open up the floor now to some Q&A. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll come and get you. The very first question, though, is one I would like to ask. What should Americans do with inflation and governments increasing their interest rates?
Inflation and government interest rates?
Yes.
Well, thank you, and they are obviously connected. When you had the inflation, the Federal Reserve reacted by raising interest rates. And so, again, that's the double whammy on our families. What does the federal government need to do? We need to stop spending so much money. And whenever, as a governor, we received stimulus money, and we received money to help our citizens get through the pandemic, and to those that were not able to work, they had extra compensation. Well, they sent us that money. We couldn't spend it all, and they sent us more money. And so I actually started turning down federal money. And as a state, that was important. So we wanted our people to get back to work. We wanted to encourage and incentivize work and not just simply receiving a government paycheck. And so the federal government spent too much money, and in particularly the last Inflation Reduction Act that spent trillions of dollars. That's what led us to where we are today. How do you get that back under control? You get it back under control by reducing some of the excess expenditures we have, having more discipline. We need to bring the federal bureaucracy under control, and we need to return more authority to the states, particularly in the terms of how we administer the Medicaid program. All of these things will give the states more flexibility, management of it, but save us tax dollars in the end. Finally, I think we need a balanced budget amendment to our Constitution. We have a balanced budget in Arkansas. The states have to live under that. Obviously, there's times where you need stimulus, that you need wartime coverage, but as a normal matter, we need to budget responsibly, we need to control spending, and that is what will reduce the inflationary pressures.
Next question's over here.
Governor, thank you very much for those refreshing, strong, common sense remarks. The question I have has to do with energy and climate change, and what we're hearing now with the current administration, with the rules of climate change and the Inflation Reduction Act. There's been kind of cutting down on production of fossil fuels, and I've noticed, I'm a visitor here, and I noticed that gasoline's almost $5 a gallon here in California. And what's your position on the production of fossil fuels, or are you for kind of unleashing them again to help bring the economy back, or what's your position on that, sir?
The answer is yes. We need to produce energy in the United States of America. And obviously, we have to be sensitive to the environment, and in Arkansas, we're shifting from coal to more gas-fired generators, but we have a mix of energy sources. We have hydropower, we have nuclear power, we have solar power that's expanding in our state, and we have traditional gas electricity that is produced. And so this is important to have that energy mix. But I think about California. California is a big state that produces a lot, and you need energy. And you don't want to live with the threat of brownouts and blackouts and rolling shutdowns of electricity. You don't want to run short on power. And we have to produce in this country. And the Biden administration set a very inconsistent policy. Actually, they set a green-only policy to begin with. And when that happened, the energy producers stopped. They can't make huge capital investments if you're going to have a federal policy that opposes you. And so production slowed down. The Biden administration, after they ran out of oil in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and they couldn't get oil from Venezuela or Saudi Arabia, they said, we better start producing more. Well, it's too late then. That inconsistent policy doesn't work. And so, sure, we need to have a diversified energy sources and we can expand, but let's produce energy, and the hydrocarbons has to be a part of it.
Next question over here.
Governor, thank you. with Russia providing fuel to China and giving China an economic advantage, would we have tariffs on China? Is that some solution maybe?
Well, we do have the Trump tariffs still in place. So we have tariffs that are significant, and the Biden administration has left them in place. So I don't see any current movement to change those. But whenever you're looking at the relationship of China and Russia, that China should be careful because there is there's sanctions against Russia. There's sanctions for their crimes against humanity and for their violation of the sovereignty. And if China wants to aid and abet in that, then I think the Western world is going to say, you're going against the sanctions that we have in place. What kind of sanctions should we put on China? And so that remains to be seen, and I think that's why China is being very careful right now. And I'd like to think that I know they're providing dual-use equipment such as drones, but we don't see right now heavier armament, but we will see what happens in the future, and I think the Western alliances will respond to that if we see greater provision of material to Russia.
Great. Next question is right over here.
Good evening, Governor. Thank you for visiting with us this evening. My question was a follow-up to the accomplishment that you mentioned in Arkansas with respect to requiring every high school student to graduate learning computer science. I think many others would agree with that's a great idea. With respect to manufacturing, though, there's been long-standing debate about jobs being shipped overseas. You mentioned us bringing in new talent from other countries if we don't figure out our own, labor infrastructure. What opportunities do you believe are not being tapped here in the country that could maybe steer some people who might believe that their lives are dependent on manufacturing or are very vulnerable to their jobs being lost in that? Because in a free market system, you can't really stop companies from sending jobs overseas. So what opportunities might there be to train people and educate them early into other sectors here in the United States so that we're not quite as dependent on that?
Great question and great point that you make. And first of all, we need to train a workforce that's skilled in manufacturing. I'm proud of the fact that Arkansas, I think, ranks 6th in the nation in the percent of our workforce that has experience in manufacturing. And that's part of the reason we were able to recruit United States Steel out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to Arkansas. They're building a $3 billion steel mill, state-of-the-art, technologically advanced, 900 employees that will get paid over $100,000 apiece, and it's skilled labor. And we won that, and won it because of the ease of doing business in Arkansas. But when that goes into production, Arkansas will pass Pennsylvania as the #1 steel producing state in the nation. Now, the point of the story is that it's leadership that shows we need to make things in the United States. We can produce, we can lead in steel production. We don't have to ship it all in from overseas. And so that's an example of where we need to illustrate and continue to emphasize manufacturing. In terms of the skilled workforce, I think it's very important that we make sure that our students have an opportunity for college or a certificate or a 2-year college or a trade school that they can have the benefit of and go straight in and make a good living. And it could be in the computer sciences, it could be in any type of manufacturing skill. And one of the things that can be done to support that is right now our Pell Grants are used for, if you want to go to college, get a Pell Grant, if you qualify for that. Well, we could use the Pell Grants also for education in trade certificates and trade schools, which is not allowed right now. So that's an example of where we can expand the training of our skilled workforce.
Great. Next question is right over here.
Thank you so much for your remarks on China. In regards to the intellectual property and technology transfers that we see with China, what would you do to safeguard and really reinforce the blocks on American intellectual property and technology from being transferred illegally, albeit, to China in order to further enhance not only our STEM part of our economy, but also our other industries as a whole?
Well, a couple things that need to be done in terms of the transfer of intellectual property. Whenever you're looking at our review of transfer of technology, we need to deepen that. The Commerce Department, the State Department has that responsibility. And whenever we have sensitive technologies that are being transferred by industry, they have the ability to look at it and they can have to grant a license. So we can deepen that and making sure that our sensitive technologies are protected. The second part of it is the private sector. The private sector needs to be careful because some of the technologies that are copied might just be in the manufacturing process. They don't really qualify for a license. But the private sector needs to understand the competition that is there and how easy it is to steal. They need to protect it and take their own initiatives there. And then, we just have to do everything that we can to have a trade policy that holds China accountable if they violate the rules. And that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of energy. It takes some enforcement mechanisms, but that's critically important. And so those are a couple things I think we can do.
Next question right over here.
Okay.
And then we have one up here on the front too.
This is probably out of everything we've been talking about, but I'm a teacher and really worry about the school shootings that have been happening. I feel like I want to retire this year. What do we do about the gun control and these shootings that are happening?
Any questions appropriate, so thank you, ma'am, for it, and thank you for teaching in our schools. We've emphasized safety of our schools, and so we've really invested in security training, which is a shame that you have to do that with our teachers and our students, but also we've enhanced the grants that we give to our local school districts for security reviews, for enhancing the facilities so that they're designed in a more secure fashion with safe rooms and things like that. And so that's the approach that we've taken, and there's some success in that. And every school, handles it a little bit different way. But in our society, I think that's the best approach, and we have to invest in it in our local communities. Parents expect their children to go to school safely, and we need to expect our teachers to be safe as well.
All right, we got one last question over here.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Governor. Right over here.
Yes, please.
My name is Beverly. I want to say thank you for being here and thank you for your speech. So in your speech, you made a really excellent point about bringing manufacturing of PPE back to the U.S. because of the issues we had during the pandemic. On a related note, I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on improving the current healthcare medical system that we have in the U.S.?
All right, the question is, and I do want to give this gentleman the last question, if you don't mind. He's had his hand up for a while. In terms of our healthcare system, first of all, we need to train healthcare workers. I mean, we need to recruit and be able to make sure the pipeline has sufficient healthcare workers, and that's an important part of it. I believe that America innovates very well in our healthcare system, and so I think it's important to have competition. I think it's important to reward investment in healthcare, and I don't believe that we need to move to a national healthcare system because that is what discourages that innovation, that investment, the competition in healthcare. So those are a couple things. I think we are very technologically advanced. I think that was illustrated by the fact that we were able in warp speed to develop a vaccine during COVID. That's a tribute to our pharmaceutical industry and their success. So I think the challenge is really more in the services, in the management of our hospitals, and the flexibility you have, and expanding those healthcare choices for Americans.
Now the last question of the day.
Governor, during COVID, there was the realization that we were totally dependent upon China for not just PPE, but antibiotics. And I really appreciate the points you were bringing up. Are you aware, this was 3 years ago now, has anything happened where we're bringing the manufacturing of antibiotics or PPE or other critical items that we need to be self-sustaining? Is anything happening?
Well, we did it in the world of chips. So we had the CHIPS Act, which incentivized bringing back the manufacturing of semiconductors and computer chips. But in terms of the healthcare, there's been a state-by-state approach to that. Some states have incentivized manufacturing of medical equipment or PPE in the state. We've tried to encourage our industry to do it, and they've responded. So it has been increased, but it has not been government managed. It's been primarily private sector initiative because they see that's what needs to be done, and there's an opportunity to produce a product that people need. The other thing is storing. We've actually trying to be prepared for the next pandemic. So we've set up, the inventories that we need so we won't be caught off guard again.
Well, just one other overarching question. Do you think within the current makeup of the administration and Congress, do we have the political will to really flex not flex our muscles, but to really change how we deal with China?
Well, there's bipartisan concern over China and their dominance and their competition and their repression of freedom. So there is some bipartisan concerns. So I think there is hope there. I don't, quite frankly, believe anything's going to be happening over the next year and a half in Congress of any significance because it's divided. And so many of these things are going to wait to be guided by the 2024 election and the new leadership that we have. But I do believe that the relations with China is something that there is some bipartisan support and consensus on. And there is a little bit of division in terms of Ukraine itself. But I, for one, believe we need to stick there and to make sure we continue to support that. And hopefully that'll be the position of Congress.
All right, let's get a round of applause for Governor Hutchinson.